Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Church. I work at the National Women's Law Center as an advocacy manager on our child care team. Thank you guys so much for joining us for today's webinar, Rethinking Workforce Training for Low-Income Moms. I'm going to hand it over to Amy Matsui, who will be orchestrating the majority of today's conversation, and she will get us started with introductions and a couple of poll questions. Amy?
Thanks so much, Jessica. I'm Amy Matsui, Senior Counsel and Director of Government Relations at the National Women's Law Center, and we're so excited to welcome you to this webinar today. Just a couple of housekeeping things. You'll note that you can listen to the webinar either through your computer audio or on the phone, so just note that those two options are available. I also wanted to flag for you that you can submit questions through the chat through the kind of the dialogue box on the website. So please, if you have questions for our presenters today, please feel free to send those in through the website. I wanted to note that the webinar is being recorded so that folks who are not able to join us today can also listen to the presentation. And I wanted to highlight for you that we will be sending around the PowerPoint, a link to the recording, and some additional resources in a follow-up email in a couple of days. So we have a great presentation today and kind of a packed agenda, so I'm going to get us started. At the National Women's Law Center, we have a particular focus on low-income women and their families, and we understand the fundamental importance of childcare for low-income women who are working or going to school. We're excited to be sponsoring this webinar today to focus on these issues in the context of workforce development. Today, we're going to explore the critical importance of the intersection of childcare and job training and hear about an innovative program that gives low-income women training that has the potential to boost them out of poverty and the childcare that will enable them to participate in that training. We're privileged to have two incredible presenters and partners today. Gina Adams is Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. Gina is a nationally recognized expert on the factors that shape the affordability, quality, and supply of childcare and early education services, and the ability of low-income families to benefit from them. She's also the director of the Bridging the Gap project at Urban. Today, Gina will be setting the stage by talking about the childcare needs of low-income parents needing education and training. And Carol Burnett, who has just survived yet another hurricane this season, is the founder and executive director of the Mississippi Low-Income Child Care Initiative. The initiative improves the child care assistance program serving low-income working parents and strengthens the financial viability of the child care centers that serve them. Carol is also the executive director of Moore Community House, a nonprofit community center providing affordable childcare and job training in non-traditional occupations for low-income single mothers in Biloxi, Mississippi. Today, Carol will be talking about the Women in Construction program at Morehouse. I am going to get out of the way of these two amazing presenters, and I will moderate questions at the end of the presentation. So we really would appreciate if you would submit any questions that you have through the website. Before we get started, though, we did want to find out a little bit about all of you. We're so grateful for your time, and we just want to make sure that we're tailoring the presentation to the best of our ability. So we have a couple of poll questions. The first question that we have for you is, where do you work? Please select one of the following: advocate, government agency, local service provider or community agency, and the ever popular other. So please take a minute to select one of these options, and Jessica will show us the results in just a minute. Okay, let's see what they say. So we're just waiting to see the results of the poll question pull up. And it looks like Jessica, do you have a sense of what that, there we go. So it looks like about 39%, almost 40% of you all today are advocates. We have 13% government agency attendees, about 22% local service provider or community agency, and 26% identifying as other. Thank you. So let's move on to the next poll question. and that is to ask you about your area of expertise. Please select one of the following: childcare, workforce development, both, or other. So we're going to give you, again, just a moment to select one of these options: childcare, workforce development, both, or other. And as soon as we have some results, we'll bring them up on the screen. Great, thank you. It looks like about 32% of the attendees identified as childcare experts, 23% as workforce development, and 18% as both, with 27% identifying at their area of expertise as other. And then the final poll question that we have for you today: what would you say is your current level of knowledge about the issue of childcare for parents seeking education and training? Please select one of the following: are you new to the issue, somewhat involved but not intensively and want to learn more, or are you actively working on the issue? I'll just give everybody a couple of seconds to pick one of these options, and we'll show the poll results. So it looks like over half of you are somewhat involved in the issue of childcare for parents seeking education or training, and you want to learn more. About 9% of you are new to the issue, and 35% are actively working on the issue. Well, again, we are so grateful for your time today and glad that you can join us. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Gina Adams. Gina, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy, and the National Women's Law Center for hosting us. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you today. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about a project that we're doing on this exact issue, which is trying to look at the intersection between workforce development for low-income parents and child care. Next slide, please. What I want to do is briefly tell you a little bit about the project so you can know where to get more information, and then high-level summary about some of our findings on the need for this type of support, some of the challenges that parents face, some of the challenges at system level, and some strategies that you might want to consider. Next slide, please. So the Bridging the Gap project is supported by the Ford Foundation and Annie Casey Foundation. As I mentioned, our real effort is trying to elevate and address the childcare needs of low-income parents who need education and training. I co-lead this project with Shane Spalding, who's an expert on workforce development. We have found that you really have to have a cross-disciplinary team to do this kind of work because both of these areas are so complicated. I want to take 1 minute just to describe terminology a little bit because I think depending on which system you're aware of, the other one can be a bit of a mystery. So when I say workforce development here, I'm thinking about education and training, both of them. It can be anything from community colleges and higher ed to local workforce boards to the WIOA to Goodwill, any place that's trying to focus on education and training for families. And then when I use the word child care, I'm including the entire range of child care and early education programs and policies, including out of school time for older kids. Next slide, please. What we've done with this project is really talked to a lot of people, done some data analysis, and we have a very large number of, well, large for us, 6, 7, 8 publications. Some of them, one of them is really provides an overview of the two systems and how they work together and don't work together for families. We have some publications looking at the extent of the problem and the needs. We have some publications on some of the key policy systems, including the Child Care and Development Fund, or CCDF, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, WIOA, and TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And we have a publication looking at strategies that are employed by local programs and different strategies they take. We also held a big convening here and wrote up some findings from that. All of these publications can be found at this link. It's a landing page where they're all in one place. So feel free to go look at that. Next slide, please. I'm going to go quickly through these because I think we all know why this matters. Obviously, education and training is absolutely critical to economic security and mobility for low-income women and their families. We all know that childcare is a major barrier, both to enrollment, but also to completion of education and training. We also know that quality early care and education is essential for children's healthy development and success. So all these pieces together are really critical for kind of a two-generation strategy that focuses both on the needs of children and families. I do want to say that for a variety of reasons, these issues have not gotten the attention they need, and it's one of the reasons I'm so delighted that we're having this conversation today. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of some of the facts about the needs. There's 21 million low-income parents. About almost 60% have a high school credential or less. 1 in 6 U.S. adults have basic or lower levels of literacy. Almost a third possess basic or lower levels of numeracy. Only about 1 in 10 low-income parents are enrolled in education and training. Half of these parents also work. 60% of them are single parents. 51% are single mothers. 69% have a child younger than 6. 42% have a child younger than 3. And interestingly, of those who work full-time, half of them also attend school full-time. So if you look at just those people who are already enrolled, you can see why childcare is a really big issue. And I also just want to point out the working and attending school or education and training. I think people often think that there's one or the other. It's really important to understand that many low-income parents are actually blending these realities at the same time. Next slide. We find that parents are underrepresented in education and training programs. And interestingly, the low-income parents who are not in education and training programs, not surprisingly, have even lower levels of education than those who are. 2/3 of those who are not enrolled have a high school degree or less. So that kind of, while it's hard to pinpoint needs sometimes, these are some factors that kind of help illustrate the issue. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go quickly through these. There's a lot of challenges for parents who are trying to make this work. One of them is that it's very complicated to arrange for childcare for the education training activities, as I mentioned, often coupled with work. In particular, the scheduling challenges and making that match the schedules and availability of childcare is a big challenge, particularly for families who are working during non-traditional hours or getting their training in non-traditional hours or who have varying schedules. It would be a very major barrier in terms of accessing care. Second major barrier is limited information about childcare options. It's complicated enough for parents to be finding care for their work schedule. It can be very complicated if they have to add in these unusual schedules, which may be for different periods of time, and can be very kind of overwhelming. The third one that we're all very aware of, obviously, is the financial constraints that families have in terms of being able to pay for it, and there's just basically very limited access to childcare subsidies or low-cost or free care options. And then finally, there's a limited supply of good quality care, period. And it's particularly hard for some populations, again, infants and toddlers, children with disabilities, non-traditional hour care, care in rural areas. So when your programs are thinking about trying to meet the needs of families, it's important to recognize that this is the complexity of the kinds of needs that may need to be addressed if you're going to try to support families in this effort. Next slide, please. There's a number of challenges at the system level. One is that workforce development and childcare systems, and you'll see that I put those in quotes, they are not systems, but they have overlapping goals and overlapping target populations, but they also have some real challenges. One is they both are incredibly underfunded in terms of the number of people who are eligible who could use the services. There's simply not enough money there in either system to be able to meet those needs. Neither of the systems prioritize low-income parents who seek education and training, except for TANF. But generally, these families are kind of the lowest priority for each group because of the complexity of their needs. The expense of their needs, when you talk about the workforce side, it's going to be childcare can be very expensive to provide. And then for the childcare side, the priorities are often given to families who are already employed rather than families who are seeking education and training to get better employment. Both of them have policies and incentives that can create barriers to access for this population. Both of them are very complicated. They have multiple sectors and actors and agencies. I came at the workforce side from a childcare perspective and was stunned, and still am learning after 3 years, about all the different players in that space. They operate very separately, and finally, they are really devolved in very complex ways within and across systems. So within each system, you have, like on childcare, you have federal to local for Head Start, you have federal to state to local for childcare, you have state to local for pre-K, similar kinds of complexities on the workforce side. So it makes it hard when you're trying to figure out how to put these pieces together to figure out who your partners could be. Next point, please. Next slide. So let me just briefly talk about some of the opportunities and challenges in each of the two major systems here. First of all, the Child Care and Development Fund, the CCDF, which is the major child care assistance program funded by the federal government with state contributions. We have more on all of these pieces, but we did a quick look at state subsidy eligibility rules, and they are all over the map. Basically, most states say that these families are eligible for child care and development for subsidies under the CCDF. But in reality, each one of them may have very different. Some you can only get it if you're working full time. Some of them you can only get it if you don't work. Some you can get if you get this GPA or that kinds of attendance or this kind of program. So there's a lot of constraints, and we find that they're often very low priority. You find relatively few families in most states that are in the subsidy system are there for education and training reasons. With the CCDF was recently reauthorized, and there's both some opportunities and some challenges that I'll mention in a minute, but there's a real focus on things like family-friendly policies, which provides opportunity to design programs that meet the needs of parents. For example, one of them is continuity of care, so that you don't necessarily, if a family has like a spring break or a summer break, can't take them off the program as easily as was possible before. There's a real emphasis on cross-system linkages, on consumer education, and on thinking about strengthening the supply to meet the needs of special populations. One of the groups that's targeted there is non-traditional hour. Families need non-traditional hour care, which is particularly relevant to this population. There are some constraints that I will mention briefly. One of the challenges that I think Carol has named in Mississippi in particular, but in other places, is one of the challenges that because this was passed without additional resources and there's a number of other requirements that put significant requirements on states, you're finding that a lot of states are having to dial back on their services, the number of families they're serving. So this population, families, education, and training, already were low priority, and they're in many places become even lower priority, it appears, from what we can tell. So that's a very big dampening factor on this, but it doesn't mean that there's still are opportunities that I think we need to be pursuing. Next slide, please. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was also reauthorized around the same time. It also has some interesting opportunities. They have a real focus, for example, on parents with barriers to employment, including single parents and young parents, much more emphasis than in the prior law. So that kind of paves the way to think about services for this population. They have career pathway models, which really thinks about how do you take people with limited skills and provide them the skills and supports for advancement over the longer term. And you can think about supports like childcare being really critical for that pathway. Also emphasizes individualized assessment and career plan development, which allows you to think about really bringing in assessing childcare needs as part of that. And there's a special initiatives provision that allows governors to set aside funds for special efforts, which could be focusing on this issue. And there's also a very strong, like in the CCDF, there's a strong focus on partnering. So it offers a real opportunity to think about partnering with childcare. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, there are some big challenges. Both, when you look at how this is playing out in the states are overwhelmed with the demands of this legislation. Both systems are still underfunded, and as I mentioned, the CCDF, they have new requirements and don't have the money to meet them, and so they're actually probably facing the challenges of reducing services, which is of great concern. They both still have strong disincentives to serve this population, in part because of the funding constraints. And of course, the fundamental challenge is that we just have a very inadequate child care market where the availability of good quality, affordable care is challenging even in the best of circumstances. And that underlies the challenges that we're going to be talking about. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into these. We can talk more about them later if you want, but there are some opportunities to be aware of. There is temporary TANF, obviously, which I think you'll be hearing certainly more about from Carol. There is a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Education and Training, which we call SNAP ENT, which a number of places are using to support these kinds of services. There is a one-time only kind of grant that went out that actually is funding Carol's project called Strengthening Working Families Initiative at the Department of Labor, which I think is going to be bringing us some interesting findings and learning opportunities about how to do this work. And there's an ongoing interest in the philanthropic world in the whole kind of issue of 2-gen programming, though I gather we now have to use some new names for it. But there's still, I think, a very strong awareness of the needs of meeting the needs of families in a more holistic way that still presents an opportunity, I think. Okay, let me quickly go through next slide. And I'm not going to describe these in depth, but this is just when in our paper on strategies, we kind of laid out the things that local programs can do. You can do one of these, multiple of these. One is to really assess the needs in the community and identify partners. Each workforce project is different, has different kinds of scheduling needs, target populations, the market it's operating in, the childcare opportunities are different. So really understanding local realities when you're trying to set up these kinds of efforts is important. Second is to think about designing the education training services themselves to facilitate access to childcare. For example, scheduling during the day, block scheduling, cohort models, those kinds of things. Third one is to make assessing participants' childcare needs a part of intake and planning and assessing on an ongoing basis because childcare needs are not static. Next slide. Fourth, helping parents understand and find childcare options in the community. That often can be a really critical piece of the puzzle, even if you can't provide actual subsidies to pay for it. Fifth is helping family access subsidies to offset the cost of care. And sixth is to facilitate access to a supply of affordable care. So obviously each of these is a big topic, but those are the kinds of things that can happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol and have her tell you about her fabulous project.
Thanks, Gina. I am joined here in Biloxi with my fabulous team here at the Mississippi Low-Income Child Care Initiative and the Women in Construction Job Training Program. Can we have the next slide? We worked to release this policy brief. The cover is there on that slide. It outlines our approach to serving low-income single moms with young children that's proving to be fabulously successful. And there's a link on this slide for you to download the policy brief, and my comments are going to be based on this policy brief. Next slide, please. We are a community-based program working to build low-income women's economic security. And we served on our state's WIOA planning team. It was the state planning team to design our Workforce Investment Opportunity Act state plan. The workforce leaders that we worked with on that planning team were concerned about Mississippi's low workforce participation rate and about the gap between the middle skills jobs that were available compared with the number of people in Mississippi who are prepared by education and training to meet those jobs, the requirements of those jobs. And the workforce leaders were also very concerned about the lack of affordable child care that parents need in order to be able to go to work. So our program offers a model that is a practical example for replication that addresses all of these concerns. Our policy brief describes the model and offers information about replication for other workforce training and child care programs, and we have a particular focus on low-income single moms. In Mississippi, single moms participate in the labor force at a higher rate than the population overall, but find themselves stuck in low-wage jobs where they need child care assistance and they need training that leads to higher paying work. To disrupt occupational segregation in the Mississippi workforce and gender wage disparity, women need to get higher paying work. Non-traditional work, where women are drastically underrepresented, pays more. Next slide, please. Workforce programs need to be proactive in order to disrupt current patterns of occupational segregation. If moms are going to get training, but they're only being referred into the training that leads them right back into low-wage jobs, even if child care is provided, this training will only reinforce the patterns of gender wage disparity and occupational segregation, leaving moms unable to achieve economic security through the work that they do. In the realm of middle skill occupations, higher paying work for women means that non-traditional work in which women are drastically underrepresented but better paid than those jobs where women are concentrated in Mississippi's workforce. Next slide, please. The model that we have here at the Moore Community House Women in Construction program indicates that the combination of child care for these single moms with these pathways to higher paying jobs is the model that has demonstrated a successful pathway moving low-income moms to economic security. We were able, as Gina referenced earlier, to combine funds from the Department of Labor Strengthening Working Families Initiative grant with a grant from our state's TANF welfare funding to be able to provide both the job training and the child care assistance that's so needed to move these single moms into jobs that are going to pay living wages. Next slide, please. So here you can see on the left that women in Mississippi, single moms in Mississippi, do work. That pie chart shows that 67% of children who are living with a single mom have their mom in the labor force. But on the right, what you see is the comparison of median earnings, showing that the median earnings for single moms is significantly lower than that of families headed by single dads or by married couples. Next slide, please. Nearly half of all Mississippi's children live with a single parent, virtually all of whom are single moms. Next slide, please. Of children who are living in poverty, 78% of them are living in a single parent household. And again, this is the result of occupational segregation, gender wage disparity, the high cost of childcare, all the factors that keep these families in poverty despite the parents' efforts at work. Next slide, please. This demonstrates that the costs of childcare take a much bigger bite out of the income of single mom-headed families than out of married couple families. You can see the red wedges of the pie are the cost of childcare out of the entire family income. Next slide, please. This is a chart that shows the incredibly helpful difference that having a child care voucher makes to low-income working families in the state of Mississippi. As Gina was talking about, this slide references the Federal Child Care Development Fund block grant that comes to all states. And in Mississippi, if a parent had to pay for child care without this benefit, she would have to pay over $4,000 a year. If she gets a voucher to help with the cost of child care, that voucher will reduce her annual cost down to about $700 a year. So you can see it makes an incredibly positive difference for a family's economic security to be able to get a child care voucher. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, also as Gina referenced, the reach of this program is incredibly small. The pie chart on the left shows Mississippi children ages birth to 5, and the programs we have in Mississippi that offer some kind of public benefit for parents to help pay the cost of child care, all together, the Child Care Development Fund, Head Start and Early Head Start, pre-K. Our state doesn't have a state-funded pre-K program as part of our education system, but some local school districts have taken it upon themselves to initiate a few pre-K programs. But even if you put all of those programs together, you will see that it leaves 71% of the eligible children in Mississippi aged birth to 5 without being served by any one of those programs. And then if you look to children aged 6 to 12, we're only serving 5% of those children, and that's all with the CCDF program, leaving 95% of children unserved. And so the need is significant and far outstrips the resources that are available. Next slide, please. This slide shows that Mississippi single moms need education and training. On the left, you can see that for single moms who are below poverty, about 60% have less than a high school degree or a high school degree or GED, indicating that there is a great need for education and training. Next slide, please. And here, this just demonstrates that in the workforce system in Mississippi, the higher concentration of women in that particular occupation, the lower the salary. You can see those bars on the left-hand side of this graph show high concentrations of women at salaries that are much lower than those bars on the right that show high occupations where the workers have a high concentration of being men. And the next slide please, gives us a particular example here. Traditional work, office administrative. You can see that this particular occupation in Mississippi has 77% of women workers with the earning of about $28,000 a year. And on the right, the occupation of construction extraction occupations, only 2% of those workers are women, and yet the earnings are significantly higher at over $40,000 a year. Next slide, please. So again, the model that we have addresses the challenges and the problems that these slides have suggested that we're facing in Mississippi, trying to help single moms with young children, combining child care through the innovative use of our TANF welfare block grant with our non-traditional training, which builds a pathway for women into jobs where women make up a small percent of the workforce but can really earn higher wages. Next slide, please. So we're focusing on single moms with young children. Often the participants in our job training program are victims of domestic violence. And as I mentioned, they all have an incredible work history, but despite working, they remain poor and low income. Next slide, please. We have been able to successfully place about 70% of women trainees into jobs that pay up to 3 times more than they previously earned. And the More Community House Women in Construction Job Training Program is the only non-traditional program for women on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And this partnership that we're engaged with the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative offers child care to address the crucial need that women have for child care. Next slide, please. So just a word about how this model could be replicated. For purposes of job training recruitment, it's important to target single moms and to have recruitment materials that reflect images of single moms so that women can begin to think of non-traditional options as options that they can take advantage of so that they see themselves in these job sites, in these roles. That the recruitment needs to be done at places where low-income single moms are, child care centers, battered women's centers, that job training programs need to be proactive about getting women into these non-traditional jobs, to train frontline workers on interrupting occupational segregation, to increase the number of women in non-traditional work, and to ensure that child care will be provided. And like Gina said, the funding for that is a challenge, and so revenue needs to be identified, such as sources within WIOA, the Child Care Development Fund, the TANF Welfare Program, SNAP E&T, etc. And programs can be advocates to make their states choose to direct these funding streams to child care for programs that are supporting women in non-traditional training. And we have a practical guide to include child care and job training programs that we would be happy to share. So I will conclude there and be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Gina and Carol. We really appreciate your sharing your expertise, and Carol for talking us through some of the details of what's a really exciting and disruptive program, and disruptive in a good way, for breaking some of the stereotypes and some of the barriers that keep low-income moms in poverty, despite the tremendous amount of work that they do to support themselves and their families. So we do have some time that for questions, and just to remind you again that if you have a question that you'd like to have asked, please do submit it through the website. There is a box above the chat function, so please go ahead and send those in. And we will take some time to ask a couple of questions. And also just to remind folks that we will send around the PowerPoint, the recording, and some of the materials that we talked about during the presentation in a follow-up email over the next couple of days. So the first question that I wanted to ask is a question for Gina. Gina, what policy steps can we take to better coordinate workforce development and childcare?
You know, one of the blessings of this field is the curse, but it is also a blessing, and that there are a lot of different pieces of this puzzle. So there's WIOA, there's CCDF, there's TANF, there's SNAP-ENT. And I think, you know, what you find for Carol's example, for example, she found an opportunity with TANF. Other people are finding opportunities with CCDF. Some people may be attacking this through their WIOA program. So I think the first thing to do is to really look at the state level, what your policy context is. These are systems that have a lot of state action. So, for example, the publication we did on the CCDF rules shows that, you know, you may be in a state that really has created big barriers in CCDF for families in education and training to be able to get child care support, in which case that would be a good place to be focusing your energies, is to think about how you can loosen that up. Or it may be that there's a big opportunity in that there's already a conversation going on between WIOA and CCDF, and you can get yourself in there. So I think the first thing to do is to really map out, see where the opportunities and challenges are in your state, take advantage of the opportunity, and start taking steps to address the challenges.
Great, thank you. And I think this question is probably for Carol. Carol, what outcomes are you hoping to see when you evaluate the Women in Construction program?
We're really gathering data that's going to demonstrate the impact, the positive impact of providing child care assistance to improve the successful outcomes of the single mom job training participants. The Women in Construction program has been serving low-income women for a while, but it's really since the Strengthening Working Families initiative and the funding that we were able to get through TANF that we were able to provide child care assistance. And so our primary focus is to try to demonstrate the positive impact that makes, because we want to use the support for improving the success rate as advocacy for targeting additional funds to provide child care for job training participants.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that folks on the call and elsewhere will be really interested to see those findings when you've had a chance to evaluate. Another question about the program, Carol, is how did you get the idea to focus on construction and shipbuilding training for the Women in Construction program?
Our Women in Construction program was it grew out of our response to Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. We saw recovery jobs in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina that women needed to be trained to be able to take advantage of. And as we continued to provide a pathway for women to get into non-traditional jobs, and we began to get out of the recovery mode post-Hurricane Katrina, we built some relationships with employers along the coast, and one of our largest employers is the Ingalls Shipbuilding. And so we have chosen a particular occupations and curriculum and pathways in response to what the job opportunities are here on the Gulf Coast.
Great, thank you. Gina, this question is, it seems like there's almost no shot at additional federal CCDF or WIOA or TANF funding. What else can advocates be doing?
I think there's a couple of answers to that question. I think one of the pieces that just strikes me is that we really need to be doing a better job of raising awareness about this problem. It feels to me like it's the elephant in the middle of the room often in these conversations, and unfortunately both systems are so overwhelmed with trying to meet the needs of other families that the needs of these families simply don't rise to the surface. But if we don't address them, then we're facing, I think, leaving families in a very, very difficult situation who are trying to move ahead. So I think, first of all, doing your best to raise awareness about this. Second of all, it was interesting to see the layout of who does what on this call. It was great to see people from both workforce side and the child care side. But really thinking about identifying partners and working across these systems, I have been really impressed with people who do that, but also how many times when you talk to somebody in the other system, it's kind of this blank stare like, what? So I think really thinking through what is shared goals and responsibilities and how to reach out across these sectors and bridge that gap is important. Doing a better job of identifying the problem. I think there's places where we have access to information and data on these kinds of issues where nobody has just simply not pulled it together. You saw kind of some of the great work Carol's done to pull those things together, but making this point, I think, is part of the raising awareness issue. And then I think finally just really thinking through what steps you can take. I mean, what was interesting to me, it kind of goes back to my comment earlier about the complexity and range of challenges in this field is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is there's always something you can do. I mean, if you're a workforce person, even if you can't think about, if there's no way for you to reach out to the childcare side, thinking through designing, what do you know about the families you're serving and their childcare needs, and how is that integrated into your project? And are you thinking about how you are scheduling your activities in a way that meets those families' needs? So you could do that even just within the silo, right? There's also the partnerships that one can do across. Similarly on childcare, yes, we don't have a lot of money for subsidies. But one of the big constraints we found is that information is really challenging. So the role of resource referral agencies, for example, is really key. To have somebody who's, can sit down with the family and say, okay, let's think about your childcare needs now for not just your 4-year-old, but for all of your kids, and what this participating in this activity is going to do to your needs, and how stable are they, and what are you going to do during spring break, or how are you going to handle this situation? How is this playing out when your kid goes to school next year? All those kinds of thinking through, helping the families think through how to design their childcare strategy in a way that's going to make sense for their realities, their family situation, their workforce training program they are in. That's a big piece. We don't, obviously it costs money, but it's not going to be costing as much as if if your state has a complete lockdown on the CCDF funds, for example. So I think, I think reading through some of the work that we've done, there's partnerships you can develop. You can sit on a WIOA board. There's lots of ways of entering into this very fuzzy system. Reach out to your local community college, see what they're doing. So I think that there's real opportunities here that can be smaller scale, even if the big money is not coming out there. At the same time, I think we just need to make really sure that the needs of these families are on the policy agenda, and that we're doing a very good job of articulating the way our systems actually create barriers for them at this point rather than supports.
Thank you, Gina. And I'm going to ask one final question which came in for Carol. And Carol, the question is, have you partnered with unions at all? Are there opportunities in apprenticeship programs or other things like that?
Yes. We have partnered with unions, particularly on expanding apprenticeship opportunities, but I have to say that we here in Mississippi are in a right-to-work state, and there are very few unions, and so that's really not it doesn't offer the kind of partnership opportunities that would be the case in a state where unions have a robust presence. I would like to just add to the previous question's answer that Gina was providing, just to say that it is true that the resources are limited and that the systems that have to interact are difficult to decipher and difficult to integrate with each other. But I would encourage people on the call to, as Gina said, learn about those systems and try to find ways that you can influence decisions about how those resources are used. We have had a long history in Mississippi of working with our state agency to try to direct more TANF money into child care. We had opportunity to learn about the workforce system through the work of the Women in Construction program. And it really was learning that there were opportunities in both of those systems, and the long-term relationships that we had with policymakers at state agencies that were in charge of making decisions about those systems that presented opportunities for us to have conversations to really advocate for the combination of this kind of child care assistance targeted to single moms to get higher paying jobs through job training for non-traditional work. So I would just encourage people to try to learn about those systems, find opportunities, and be advocates at the state level to try to get state level policymakers to target resources to this particular population, because at least in our state, what we see is that that is the population where poverty is concentrated and where there is a tremendous amount of equity to be achieved and progress that needs to be attained.
This is Gina. I'd like to actually add one more thing. Carol, I appreciate you creating a more positive note, because I think it's really important. And I want to say kind of one concrete idea and then one broader thought. A concrete, small, but really valuable idea. One of the things we were really struck by, and I mentioned it briefly, was that when we did our review of state eligibility requirements for CCDF, for families, education, and training, I mean, it was like going back through a time capsule of different eras of what people thought workforce development should be. So there was the, work requirement ones, where some states say you have to work full time if you want to get child care subsidies. There was the, no, we really, really want to have people focus on their education and training, so you can't work. There was the, there's a lot of different, you have to have a certain grade point average. There's the, you have to do it within a certain time frame. What was fascinating to me is that it felt to me like very few of these state requirements had the good thinking of the workforce world at the table when they thought about it. In many cases, the world has evolved to have people think about how you're really going to support education and training for low-income people. And, some of them are like, what do you limit it to certain kinds of industries? So some of these are valuable ways of trying to make sure that funds are spent accountably, but they need to be based on what the workforce development world knows actually works. So that's a place for creating a partnership so that the workforce experts can come in and just talk. So how do we create eligibility requirements that make sense for childcare if we want to open this door? I think one of the reasons why people are resistant to making services available, childcare services, is it feels like it's this huge kind of, how do you measure it? How do you make sure it's accountable? How do you make sure they actually go to the programs? There's a kind of a big mushy fear of it taking the few resources as there are for a population that folks don't understand. So helping make that real, I think, is very useful. The other thing I think is really important, this is a bigger point, what I mentioned is these two systems really do have overlapping goals. Both of them are trying to help low-income families get ahead. So they serve overlapping populations, and they can help each other. Bringing in the child care expertise to the workforce side helps retention, helps completion, helps them meet goals. There are symbiotic relationships, and I think if you think about those kinds of things, it's much easier to figure out how to help yourself get connected to that other field and build those partnerships. We have a whole paper on partnerships, and that's one of the things that really comes out of that, is that these are mutually reinforcing efforts. that both sides can declare a win when it works well. And so articulating those shared goals, I think, can be really valuable.
Thank you, Gina. This is Jessica Church. I am taking over for Amy, and thank you guys so much for sharing your knowledge and talking about this really amazing partnership that's helping to lift low-income single moms and their families out of poverty. Before we go, we have one final poll question that I'm going to deploy. And so I'd love if folks could vote. And this will just give us a better sense of what type of information we should follow up with, and also give both Gina and Carol a sense of what communities involved in childcare and workforce development are looking for potentially to implement something like this, or just learn more about the topic. We'll give everybody 15 more seconds to vote. All right, super. So it looks like we've got about 52% are interested in learning more about the models. And then the other responses are split between learning more about workforce development and learning more about childcare policies. Again, we will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered and attended this webinar with more information, including the recording, the slideshow, and contact info for our presenters. Thank you guys so much on behalf of the National Women's Law Center, the Urban Institute, and the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your participation today. Bye-bye.